In the middle of the 2nd century before Christ, the Mediterranean world was not a place of balance. It was a place of suffocating hegemony. The Roman Republic had devoured its rivals one by one. The Macedonians were broken. The Seleucids were pushed back. The Greek leagues were dissolved. But there remained one ghost, one lingering shadow that haunted the Roman psyche even in its sleep. It lay across the sea on the coast of North Africa. It was the city of Carthage. By the year 149, Carthage was no longer the terrifying military superpower that had produced Hannibal. It was a neutered state. It had no navy. It had no war elephants. Its foreign policy was dictated by Rome. It was a city of merchants, farmers, and artisans, a civilization that had turned its back on war to focus on the quiet accumulation of wealth. Its fields were lush. Its harbor was busy. Its population was exploding with prosperity. And that was the problem. To the eyes of Rome, a wealthy Carthage was a dangerous Carthage. In the Senate House in Rome, an 80-year-old man named Marcus Porcius Cato the Elder became the voice of a new exterminationist policy. He was a relic of the old days, a man who had fought against Hannibal, a man who believed that Punic blood was incompatible with Roman existence. He visited Carthage on a diplomatic mission and was horrified not by its armies, but by its markets. He saw the timber stacked in the yards. He saw the gold in the temples. He saw the multitude of young men. He returned to Rome with a fig of fresh, ripe North African fig. He held it up before the Senate, the fruit still dripping with juice. This fig was picked in Carthage 3 days ago. He told them, that is how close the enemy is to your walls. From that day on, he ended every single speech, whether it was about sewer repair or tax legislation, with the same droning, thunderous mantra, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. The tragedy of the Third Punic War is that it was a war the Carthaginians tried desperately not to fight. They knew they could not win. When Rome began to mobilize its legions, gathering an army of 80,000 men in Sicily, the Carthaginian government panicked. They sent ambassadors to Rome to ask what they had done wrong, to ask what they could do to appease the anger of the Republic. The Roman Senate gave them an answer that was deliberately vague. They demanded that Carthage satisfy the Roman people. In a frantic attempt to buy survival, the Carthaginians offered a deditio, a total, unconditional surrender of their sovereignty. They placed themselves, their city, and their lands into the faith of Rome. In diplomatic terms, this should have been enough. It was the act of a vassal prostrating himself before a lord. The Senate accepted the surrender. They promised that if Carthage complied with the consul's orders, their city would be left standing, their laws respected, and their property untouched. It was a lie. It was a calculated diplomatic anesthesia designed to keep the victim calm while the knife was being sharpened. The Roman army crossed the sea and landed at Utica, just 30 miles north of Carthage. The consuls in command, Manius Manilius and Lucius Marcius Censorinus, set up their camp and waited. They did not attack. They simply summoned the Carthaginian envoys. When the envoys arrived, trembling and submissive, Censorinus laid out the first specific demand. "We are concerned," he said, "that you might rebel. Therefore, to prove your loyalty, you must give us 300 hostages. They must be the sons of your noblest families." This was a strike at the heart of the Punic aristocracy. The envoys wept. They knew that these boys would likely never be seen again. They would be raised as Romans or kept as leverage in Italian dungeons. But the city was desperate. The Council of Carthage voted to comply. The scene at the harbor as the hostages departed was one of biblical sorrow. Mothers clung to the sides of the ships, wading into the surf, screaming the names of their children as the Roman galleys rowed away. The city had paid the price in blood. They waited for the peace they had bought, but the consuls were not done. Once the hostages were secured in Sicily, the second demand arrived. The envoys were summoned again to Utica. "You are under the protection of Rome now," Censorinus reasoned, his voice calm and logical. Rome defends her friends. Therefore, you have no need for weapons. Surrender all your engines of war, all your armor, and all your spears. It was a demand for suicide. To disarm was to leave themselves naked before their aggressive neighbor, the kingdom of Numidia, and before Rome itself. But the logic of appeasement is a slippery slope. Once you have sacrificed your children, what is a pile of swords? The Carthaginians opened their armories. For days, a mournful procession of wagons rolled from Carthage to the Roman camp. The scale of the disarmament was staggering. They handed over 200,000 sets of infantry armor. They surrendered 2,000 catapults and ballistae, the artillery that protected their massive walls. They gave up hundreds of thousands of spears and javelins. When the transfer was complete, the Roman commanders invited the Carthaginian ambassadors to inspect the pile. See? They seemed to say, "We have taken your teeth." The ambassadors, thinking they had finally satisfied the beast, asked if they could now return to their city and resume their lives. They believed the transaction was complete. They had bought their lives with their dignity. But Censorinus looked at them with the cold detachment of a butcher eyeing a steer. "You have done well," he said. "There is one final requirement." The final demand was a death sentence disguised as a zoning regulation. "The Senate has decreed," Censorinus announced, "that you must abandon your city. You may build a new settlement anywhere you like within your territory, provided it is at least 10 miles from the sea. Carthage itself will be razed to the ground." The ambassadors collapsed. Some fainted. Others tore their clothes and beat their heads against the ground, screaming that they had been tricked. To ask Carthage to move 10 miles inland was not merely an inconvenience. It was an execution. Carthage was the sea. Its wealth, its culture, its religion, its very identity was tied to the harbor, to the trade winds, to the ships that connected it to the wider world. To move inland was to cease to be Carthaginian. It was to become a collection of dust-covered farmers in the desert. And that, of course, was the point. Rome did not want to disarm Carthage. Rome wanted a dead Carthage. The ambassadors begged. They pointed out that they had already given up their hostages and their weapons. They appealed to the gods, to the oaths of the Senate, to the basic laws of civilization. "You promised us our freedom," they cried. Censorinus replied with a lawyer's cruelty. "We promised that Carthage would be free. Carthage is the people, not the walls. The walls must go." The journey back to the city was a funeral march. The ambassadors knew that they were carrying a message that would unleash chaos. As they approached the gates, the crowds were waiting, thousands of anxious citizens, hoping for news of peace. The ambassadors could not speak. Their faces were masks of grief. When the truth finally came out in the council chamber, 10 miles from the sea, the reaction was instantaneous and primal. The city exploded into a frenzy of rage and self-destruction. The mob turned on the politicians who had advised appeasement. They were torn limb from limb in the streets. The ambassadors who had brought the news were butchered. Any Italian merchants unlucky enough to be in the city were stoned to death. The Carthaginians realized with a terrifying clarity that they had been played. They had given away their children and their swords, and now the executioner was at the door. But in that moment of absolute despair, something strange happened. The panic hardened into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. They had no weapons. They had no allies. They had no hope, but they had their walls. The walls of Carthage were one of the wonders of the ancient world, 45 feet high, 30 feet thick, studded with towers. The Romans were sitting at Utica, expecting a surrender. They thought the war was over. They thought they were dealing with a corpse. The Carthaginian Senate declared war. It was a declaration of defiance from a man standing on the gallows. They closed the massive gates. They freed the slaves and promised them citizenship if they fought. They turned the entire city into a factory of death. The temples were converted into workshops. The gold and silver statues of the gods were melted down to pay the workers. Day and night, The hammers rang out. They needed bowstrings for the new catapults they were frantically building to replace the ones they had surrendered. But there was no flax, no hemp. The women of Carthage, the noble matrons who had once worn silk and pearls, stepped forward. In a gesture that would be remembered for 2,000 years, they cut off their long hair and twisted it into ropes to power the engines of war. When the Roman army finally marched up to the walls of Carthage a few days later, expecting to walk into an empty ruin, they stopped in their tracks. The battlements were lined with men. The air was filled with the sound of trumpets. New shields glinted in the sun. The city they had pronounced dead was alive, and it was screaming defiance. The consuls looked at the triple walls, then at their own siege engines, and realized they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had stripped Carthage of its weapons, but they had left it with its hatred. The easy police action was over. The grinding, bloody nightmare of the siege had begun. The Romans arrived at the gates of Carthage, expecting a funeral. Instead, they found a foundry. The transformation of the city in the spring of 149 BC is one of the most singular events in the history of warfare. It was a societal metamorphosis, a collective hallucination of survival that gripped 300,000 people simultaneously. When the consuls Manilius and Censorinus marched their legions from Utica to the isthmus connecting Carthage to the mainland, they moved with the casual slowness of executioners who believe the prisoner is already bound. They brought scaling ladders, thinking they would simply climb the walls and accept the keys to the citadel. They were greeted not by weeping ambassadors, but by a storm of missiles that darkened the sky. The city had ceased to be a place of commerce and had become a single, throbbing engine of war. The decision to fight had been made in a frenzy, but the execution was carried out with a terrifying cold rationality. The Council of Carthage, usually a den of bickering oligarchs, dissolved the normal distinctions of class and gender. The sacred groves were cut down to build beams for catapults. The palaces of the rich were stripped of their lead pipes to be melted down for sling bullets. But the most desperate resource was time, and to buy time, they needed weapons, thousands of them, immediately. The historical accounts of Appian give us the numbers, and even if we account for exaggeration, the output was industrial. Every day, the citizens of Carthage produced 140 shields, 300 swords, 500 spears, and 1,000 missiles for the catapults. The workshops never closed. They operated in shifts, lit by oil lamps and the glow of the furnaces. The air in the city would have been unbreathable, thick with the smoke of smelting bronze and the dust of sawdust. And then there was the cordage. The artillery of the ancient world, the ballistae and the scorpions, relied on torsion. They needed ropes, twisted tightly to store kinetic energy. The best material for this was sinew or horsehair, but the horses had been decimated, and the cattle were being saved for food. So, the women of Carthage stepped into the breach. It was a gesture of intimate sacrifice. In a culture where long, braided hair was a symbol of status, fertility, and beauty, the matrons and daughters of the aristocracy sheared their heads bare. They wove their vanity into the machines of death. When the Roman legionaries later examined the captured artillery, they found the twisted locks of the women they had intended to enslave powering the bolts that pierced their shields. The Romans, stunned by this ferocity, fell back to prepare for a formal siege. They realized that their psychological warfare had failed. By backing the rat into a corner, they had not induced paralysis. They had induced a berserker rage. But the Carthaginians had another surprise waiting. They recalled Hasdrubal. This was not the brother of Hannibal, who had died centuries before, but a contemporary general, Hasdrubal the Boeotarch. He had been exiled merely months earlier to appease Rome, a scapegoat for the tensions on the border. Now, the city sent a frantic message to the countryside. Come back. Forgive us. Save us. Hasdrubal did not come to the city itself. Instead, he organized an army of 20,000 men in the hinterlands. He roamed the countryside, cutting off Roman supply lines, ambushing foraging parties, acting as a hammer to the anvil of the city walls. The Romans were now the ones trapped, sandwiched between the impregnable fortifications of Carthage and the harassment of Hasdrubal's field army. The Roman consuls, under immense pressure from the Senate to finish the job quickly, ordered a direct assault. Manilius targeted the landward walls on the isthmus, while Censorinus brought the fleet up to attack the weaker seaward walls near the Lake of Tunis. It was here that the Romans learned the true geometry of their problem. The defenses of Carthage were not just walls. They were a triumph of military engineering. On the landward side, facing the isthmus where Manilius attacked, lay a triple line of fortifications. The first was a low wall designed to break up infantry charges. Behind that was a water-filled ditch, palisaded and trapped. And looming behind it all was the main curtain wall 45 feet high and 30 feet thick. But this wall was not merely stone. It was a hollow two-story structure, a honeycomb of barracks and stables built directly into the fortifications. It housed 300 war elephants, 4,000 horses, and 20,000 infantrymen, along with their food and fodder. It was a self-contained fortress city that could vomit forth an army at any point along its length. Manilius ordered the battering rams forward. The Romans had constructed massive engines, protected by tortoises, wooden sheds covered in wet rawhide to prevent fire. They rolled toward the walls, the ground shaking under their weight. They managed to make a small breach in the outer wall, a glorious moment where it seemed the end had come. The legionaries surged forward with a shout of triumph. But as they scrambled over the rubble, they were met not by fleeing civilians, but by a wall of spear points and a hail of stones dropped from the towers above. The breach became a killing zone. The Carthaginians, fighting for their children who were hiding in the cellars behind them, fought with a suicidal tenacity. They pushed the Romans back, filling the ditch with the bodies of the invaders. That night, the humiliation of Rome was compounded. As the exhausted legionaries slept, the gates of Carthage silently opened. A raiding party of Carthaginians, carrying torches hidden under their cloaks, crept toward the Roman siege engines. In the darkness, the wind picked up. The Carthaginians lit their torches and threw them onto the dry timber of the rams and towers. The fire caught instantly. By the time the Roman camp awoke, their great machines were blazing skeletons against the night sky. The Romans rushed out in a panic to douse the flames, only to be slaughtered in the confusion by the Carthaginian raiders, who melted back into the shadows before the cavalry could arrive. The failure of the initial assault changed the character of the war. It shifted from a blitzkrieg to a nightmare of attrition. The summer of 149 arrived, bringing with it the suffocating heat of North Africa. The Roman camp, situated near the stagnant waters of the lake, became a breeding ground for dysentery and malaria. The invincible legions began to rot. Men died not by the sword, but by the fever, shivering in their tents while the walls of Carthage mocked them, shimmering in the heat haze. The incompetence of the Roman command became glaring. Manilius and Censorinus were politicians, not generals. They were out of their depth. They bickered over strategy, launched disjointed attacks that led to senseless casualties, and failed to secure their own supply lines. At one point, the Roman fleet was almost destroyed by fire-ship-sold hulks filled with pitch and sulfur that the Carthaginians drifted into the Roman anchorage when the wind turned. The besiegers were becoming the besieged. Yet, amidst this catalogue of Roman failure, one man began to separate himself from the mediocrity of his superiors. He was a young tribune, only 36 years old, serving as a mid-level officer in the 4th Legion. His name was Scipio Aemilianus. He was a man burdened by the weight of names. By blood, he was the son of Aemilius Paulus, the conqueror of Macedonia. By adoption, he was the grandson of Scipio Africanus, the man who had defeated Hannibal at Zama. He carried the DNA of Rome's greatest victories. In the chaos of the siege, while the consuls panicked and the centurions despaired, Scipio remained ice-cold. When a Roman detachment was cut off and surrounded in a ravine by Hasdrubal's cavalry, it was Scipio who rallied a rescue force and cut them out, saving hundreds of lives. When the consuls ordered a reckless attack on a difficult section of the wall, Scipio refused to commit his men until the flanks were secured, a decision that saved his cohort when the rest of the attack was ambushed and massacred. The soldiers began to look at him with a superstitious awe. He seemed to possess the felicitas, the divine luck of his grandfather. Even the enemy noticed. It is said that Cato the Elder, the architect of the war, hearing reports of the disaster in Africa from his deathbed in Rome, muttered a line from Homer, "Only he has his wits, the rest are flitting shadows." But wit alone could not take the city. As the year turned to 148, the siege dragged into its second year. The Romans were demoralized. The new consul, Calpurnius Piso, was even more lethargic than his predecessors. He abandoned the direct assault on Carthage entirely and tried to capture the neighboring towns, hoping to starve the capital out. He failed there too. The town of Hippocra held out against him. The siege was becoming a scandal. In the markets of Rome, the people began to whisper that the gods had turned against the enterprise. They whispered that perhaps Carthage was not meant to fall. Inside the city, the mood was a strange cocktail of agony and euphoria. They were starving, yes. The blockade was tightening. The price of grain was skyrocketing, but they were still free. They looked out from their high towers and saw the mighty Roman army bogged down in the mud, dying of plague, unable to breach the stones their ancestors had laid. They began to believe in the impossible. They repaired the walls. They built new ships in the secret circular harbor, the Carthage, hiding them from Roman view behind the high walls of the island in the harbor's center. They were preparing a counterstroke that they hoped would break the siege once and for all. But the Carthaginians were fighting against the law of averages. They had to be perfect every day. Rome only had to be lucky once. The stalemate was an illusion. In Rome, the patience of the Senate had snapped. They were done with incompetent aristocrats playing at war. They needed a killer. They suspended the laws regarding age and previous service. They looked at the young tribune who had saved the legions in the ravines. In the elections of 147 BC, the Roman people bypassed the list of candidates and roared a single name. Scipio Aemilianus was elected consul. He was given Africa as his province. He was given a mandate. Ended. The impossible defense had bought Carthage 2 years of life. But as the sails of Scipio's flagship appeared on the horizon, the city was about to learn the difference between fighting a Roman army and fighting Rome itself. In the spring of 147 BC, a ship arrived at the Roman anchorage at Utica carrying the new consul. Scipio Aemilianus stepped onto the African soil not as a savior, but as a disciplinarian. The army he inherited was a disgrace. After 2 years of failed assaults and stagnant leadership, the Roman camp had devolved into a sprawling, lawless shantytown. It was filled with unauthorized civilians, merchants selling overpriced wine, camp followers, prostitutes, and jugglers. Soldiers were trading their rations for luxuries. Sentries were sleeping at their posts. The centurions were terrified of their own men. The siege had become a business venture rather than a war. Scipio's first act was a purge. He did not launch an attack on Carthage. He launched an attack on his own army. He issued an edict that stripped the legions to the bone. Every non-combatant was ordered to leave within 24 hours. 2,000 women, traders, and slaves were expelled. He banned all hot meals, allowing only simple boiled meat and bread. He forbade the use of carts for officers, everyone, including the consul, would walk. He drilled the men relentlessly, forcing them to dig trenches and fill them back in, marching them under the midday sun until they dropped. He was forging a weapon. He told his officers, "A man who cannot control his belly cannot control the enemy." Once the army was terrified of him, Scipio turned his eyes to the city. He realized that the strategy of his predecessors' direct assault was a folly. The walls were too thick, the defenders too desperate. He would not break Carthage with rams. He would strangle it. He moved his main camp closer to the city, stretching a line of fortifications across the entire width of the isthmus. This was the contravallation, a double wall with watchtowers and ditches that completely severed Carthage from the African mainland. For the first time in the war, the isolation of the city was total. No more food could come in from the countryside. No more messages could slip out to Hasdrubal's partisans in the hills. The vast population of Carthage, swollen by refugees to perhaps 500,000 people, was trapped on a peninsula of rock and sand. They were alone with their hunger. But Scipio knew that as long as the sea remained open, Carthage could breathe. Blockade runners, wind-swift sailors who knew the shoals better than the Romans, were still slipping into the harbor at night, bringing precious sacks of grain and news from the outside world. To kill the city, Scipio had to kill the harbor. He conceived a plan of staggering ambition. He ordered his engineers to build a massive, artificial barrier of stone straight across the mouth of the harbor. It was an engineering project that seemed impossible. The water was deep, the currents were strong, and the Carthaginian archers on the walls could rain death down on the workers. But the Roman legionary was half soldier, half construction worker. They began to dump massive boulders into the sea. Day by day, the pile of rocks grew. At first, the Carthaginians watched from the walls and jeered. They shouted that Scipio was trying to fight Poseidon, that the sea would wash away his pebbles. But as the mole extended further, turning the blue water into a road of white limestone, the laughter died. The throat of the harbor was closing. The psychological impact was devastating. The Romans were literally changing the geography of the world to destroy them. But the Carthaginians were not dead yet. As the Roman mole inched closer to sealing the entrance, the sounds of frantic industry began to echo from inside the harbor. The Romans couldn't see what was happening behind the high walls of the Cotham, the circular military port, but they could hear the hammering. They assumed the Carthaginians were building ships for a last stand. They were wrong. They were building a door. In a feat of engineering that rivaled Scipio's own, the Carthaginians had dug a new canal. Working in secret, thousands of men, women, and children had excavated a channel through the eastern wall of the harbor, creating a new exit to the sea where the water was too deep for the Roman mole. Simultaneously, they had built a fleet of 50 triremes and smaller vessels out of scrap wood and old beams. On the day the new channel was breached, the Roman army stood stunned. From a solid wall of stone where no gate had existed, a Carthaginian fleet suddenly burst forth into the open sea. It was a miracle of survival. If the Carthaginians had attacked immediately, they could have annihilated the unprepared Roman fleet, which was beached and unmanned. It would have broken the blockade and perhaps ended Scipio's command. But here, the fatal hesitation that plagued Carthage throughout the war returned. Perhaps overwhelmed by the sudden glare of the sun after months in the dark ship sheds, or perhaps awaiting orders that never came, the Carthaginian admiral did not attack. He paraded his fleet in a show of defiance and then returned to the harbor. It was a gesture of pride when what was needed was a stroke of violence. Scipio did not waste the reprieve. 3 days later, when the Carthaginians sailed out again to fight, the Romans were ready. The Battle of the Port was a chaotic, brutal engagement fought in the shadow of the city walls. The sheer number of Carthaginian ships turned the engagement into a deadlock, but as they tried to retreat back into their narrow, new-made canal, disaster struck. The smaller vessels clogged the entrance. The great triremes were left exposed against the breakwater. The Roman ships rammed them against the rocks. The miracle fleet was smashed into driftwood. The last hope of breaking the blockade was gone. With the sea closed, the siege turned inward. Winter arrived, and with it came the famine. The grain stores were empty. The cats and dogs disappeared from the streets. Then the leather shields, harnesses, sandals was boiled and eaten. Finally, the people began to die. They died quietly in the alleyways. They died in their beds. The living were too weak to bury the dead, so the bodies were thrown into the empty cisterns or simply left in the streets. The stench of death hung over the city like a physical fog, visible from the Roman lines. Inside the citadel of the Byrsa, however, there was still food. Hasdrubal the Botharch, now the supreme commander of the city, had instituted a reign of terror. He had transformed from a general into a tyrant. He wore the purple robes of a king and walked the starving streets surrounded by a bodyguard of well-fed mercenaries. He commandeered the meager rations for his soldiers, reasoning that civilians were useless mouths. "The walls need men," he said, "not beggars." As the misery deepened, some Carthaginians began to whisper of surrender. To silence them and to ensure that his soldiers would never dream of defecting, Hasdrubal orchestrated a spectacle of horrific cruelty. He dragged Roman prisoners, captured in skirmishes during the early days of the siege, up to the top of the walls, in full view of Scipio's army and the starving citizens of Carthage. There, on the battlements, Hasdrubal's men tortured them. They tore out their eyes, cut off their fingers and noses, and flayed them alive with iron hooks. Then, they threw the still-living wretches off the walls to shatter on the rocks below. It was a message written in blood. There is no going back. By committing such atrocities, Hasdrubal ensured that the Romans would never grant mercy. He bound the fate of every man, woman, and child in Carthage to his own. He had removed surrender as an option. Scipio watched the butchery from his camp. His officers demanded an immediate assault to avenge their comrades. But Scipio refused. He saw the cruelty for what it was, the spasm of a dying beast. He knew that Hasdrubal had just done the Romans' work for them. He had broken the spirit of his own people. The city was no longer a united front. It was a prison camp run by a madman. Scipio tightened the noose. He attacked the outer quay of the harbor, seizing the fortified area known as the Quay of the Merchants. The Romans brought up battering rams and finally breached the wall connecting the harbor to the lower city. The outer skin of Carthage had been peeled away. The legionaries stood in the captured market square, looking up at the steep, winding streets that led to the citadel. The way was open. But Scipio paused. He knew what lay ahead. It would not be a battle of lines and maneuvers. It would be a slaughter in a maze. He let his men rest, sharpening their swords, eating their fill of Roman bread, while just a few hundred yards away, the people of Carthage listened to the silence and waited for the end of the world. Spring arrived in North Africa in 146 BC, bringing with it the scent of orange blossoms and the stench of unburied bodies. For the people of Carthage, this was the season of the end. Scipio Aemilianus had spent the winter sharpening his blade. Now, he was ready to swing it. The target was the Carthon, the circular military harbor that was the beating heart of Carthaginian naval power. Its massive outer walls had withstood the battering rams for months, but hunger had done the work that iron could not. The defenders on the ramparts were skeletal, their arms too weak to draw a bowstring, their minds clouded by the fog of starvation. At dawn, Scipio launched a surprise attack on the harbor fortifications. The resistance was brittle. The Roman legionaries, well-fed and driven by the promise of plunder, scaled the walls with terrifying speed. They slaughtered the sentries and poured into the dockyards. The great shipsheds, which had once housed the fleets that terrified Rome, were now empty caverns echoing with the screams of the dying. The Romans set fire to the remaining timber, creating a wall of smoke that shielded their advance into the city proper. The breakthrough at the Carthon was the popping of the cork. The Roman army flooded into the lower city. They spilled out of the harbor district and into the Agora, the great market square of Carthage. This was the commercial soul of the empire, a place where, just 3 years ago, merchants had traded tin from Britain, ivory from the interior of Africa, and silk from the east. Now, it was a killing floor. The initial rush was a frenzy of violence. The Romans were not just fighting soldiers. They were releasing 3 years of pent-up frustration and hatred. They cut down anyone they found, men, women, the elderly. The statue of Apollo, covered in gold leaf, was stripped by sword point in the middle of the fighting. The temple of the sun god was looted before the priests could even finish their morning prayers. But as the initial panic subsided, the resistance hardened. The Carthaginians were retreating, but they were not rooting. They fell back towards the only defensible ground left, the Byrsa. The Byrsa was the Acropolis of Carthage, a high, steep citadel that rose above the city like a tombstone. To get there, the Romans had to pass through a maze of narrow, winding streets lined with multi-story apartment buildings. These were the ancient skyscrapers of the Mediterranean, rising 6 stories high, built of stone and timber, packed tightly together. As the vanguard of Scipio's army entered these streets, the character of the war changed instantly. It was no longer a siege. It was urban warfare of the most brutal kind. The Carthaginians had turned their homes into fortresses. They occupied the upper stories and the rooftops. As the Romans advanced along the cobblestones, they walked into a vertical ambush. The air was filled with a rain of domestic debris turned into weaponry. Roof tiles, heavy amphorae, tables, and beams were hauled down from 60 feet above. The Romans were crushed under the weight of a civilization collapsing on top of them. Archers leaned out of bedroom windows to fire point-blank into the gaps of Roman armor. The narrow streets became choked with the dead, creating grisly barricades that the living had to climb over. Hasdrubal the Botharch, safe inside the citadel at the top of the hill, watched the slaughter below with a cold detachment. He had abandoned the lower city to its fate. He knew that every minute the Romans spent fighting for a single house was a minute he survived. He ordered the defenders in the streets to fight to the death, to burn the buildings if necessary to slow the enemy. He was trading the lives of his own people for time for what no one knew. Perhaps he simply wanted to delay the inevitable meeting with the executioner. Scipio, down in the Agora, realized that he was losing control of the battle. His men were being drawn into a meat grinder. They were breaking formation to loot houses, only to be butchered in the hallways by desperate fathers defending their families. The discipline of the legions was fraying in the chaos of the looting and the horror of the rooftop attacks. He made a decision that would seal the fate of the city. He halted the advance. He pulled his men back to the edge of the market square. He looked up at the 3 steep streets that led to the Byrsa, the Via Sacra, the street of the jewelers, and the street of the sandal makers, and saw that they were death traps. He would not send his men into the dark to be stabbed by ghosts. He would bring the light to them. He ordered the torch. The Romans would not capture the streets. They would erase them. They would burn the buildings one by one, leveling the city as they climbed the hill. It was a strategy of total annihilation. The breach was complete. The walls were down. The harbor was taken. But the city was not dead yet. It was writhing in agony, and Scipio was about to perform the final, terrible surgery. The order given by Scipio Aemilianus to burn the residential districts was not an act of rage. It was a solution to a logistical problem. The problem was the Byrsa, the fortified citadel at the summit of the city, and the problem was the 3 streets that led up to it. These were not the wide, paved boulevards of a Roman colony. They were the organic arteries of a Semitic metropolis, narrow, twisting, and flanked by buildings that rose 6 stories into the air. In the ancient world, only Carthage and Rome built this high. These apartment blocks, known as insulae, were hives of humanity, timber-framed and stone-clad, connected by precarious balconies and bridges. Now, they were the walls of a canyon that the Romans had to traverse under a rain of death. Scipio realized that fighting on the street level was suicide. The defenders dropped millstones and boiling pitch on the heads of the legionaries. To take the street, the Romans had to take the sky. They forced their way into the first row of houses at the bottom of the hill, butchering the families huddled in the ground floor shops, and fought their way up the staircases. Stair by stair, room by room, they ascended the vertical battlefield. When they reached the rooftops, they found themselves in a new war zone, suspended 60 feet above the ground. The fighting that ensued for the next 6 days and nights was a nightmare of acrobatics and slaughter. The streets were narrow enough that a man could leap from one roof to another or bridge the gap with a plank. The Romans moved like a swarm of iron locusts, jumping across the alleyways to engage the Carthaginians on the opposite roofs. It was intimate, chaotic combat. Men grappled on the slate tiles, slipping on blood and soot, tumbling together into the void below. A Roman centurion might stab a defender on a roof, only to be struck by a javelin thrown from a window across the street. But the sword was too slow. Scipio ordered the torch. The Romans set fire to the buildings they had cleared, using the wind to drive the flames further up the hill. The fire became a weapon more effective than any catapult. It devoured the timber frames of the high-rises. It terrified the civilians hiding in the attics and cellars, forcing them to run out into the streets where the Roman swords were waiting, or to stay and suffocate. The roar of the fire was so loud it drowned out the orders of the officers. The heat was so intense that armor became unbearable to wear. The city was not just being captured, it was being consumed. As the fire raged, the structural integrity of the city began to fail. Entire facades of buildings, weakened by the heat, sheared off and crashed into the streets. The alleyways, already choked with the dead, became blocked by mountains of smoking rubble, burning beams, and shattered masonry. This created a new obstacle. The Roman siege engines, the heavy catapults, and the towers needed to assault the final walls of the Byrsa could not move up the hill. The streets were impassable. Scipio, watching from his command post at the bottom of the slope, saw the advance stalling. He saw his cavalry immobilized by the debris. He issued a command that remains one of the most chilling in the annals of military history. He ordered the pioneers, the labor corps of the army, to clear the path. They were told to shovel the debris into the craters and ditches to make a flat road for the horses and machines. But the debris was not just stone. The historian Appian, drawing on the lost eyewitness accounts of Polybius, describes the scene with a detachment that makes it all the more horrific. The rubble that blocked the streets was a mixture of timber, stone, and human beings. There were the dead, killed by the fighting or the smoke. There were the wounded, unable to crawl away. And there were the elderly and the children, hiding in the crevices of the ruined buildings, pulled down by the collapse. When the Roman laborers advanced with their axes and mattocks, they did not separate the bricks from the bodies. They were under orders to build a road. They shoveled the dead into the holes. They overturned the wounded with their iron hooks and dragged them out of the way or packed them into the earth to level the grade. Appian writes that many of the victims were still alive, screaming as they were buried beneath the stones or trampled by the iron-shod hooves of the cavalry horses that followed the laborers. The heads of the victims protruded from the ground, their eyes wide with terror, as the Roman war machine rolled over them. The skulls were crushed under the wheels of the catapults. The soldiers, maddened by the heat, the noise, and the sheer duration of the slaughter, had lost all capacity for mercy. They were automatons of destruction. They ran over the bodies of their enemies, and in the confusion, sometimes the bodies of their own comrades. It was a descent into a primal madness, a place where the human form had lost all sanctity and had become merely matter to be moved or destroyed. This phase of the battle lasted for 6 days and 6 nights. It was a contest of endurance. The Carthaginians, trapped in the shrinking perimeter of the upper city, fought without sleep, without food, fueled only by the adrenaline of the doomed. They relieved each other in shifts, passing weapons from the hands of the dying to the hands of the living. But the Romans had a system. Scipio, the supreme organizer, rotated his troops with clockwork precision. He kept a reserve force at the bottom of the hill. Every few hours, fresh cohorts would march up the cleared streets to relieve the exhausted men at the front. The Carthaginians were fighting a hydra. Every time they killed a Roman, a fresh, well-fed, well-rested soldier stepped into his place. Scipio himself barely slept. He sat on a high point overlooking the inferno, eating food on the run, his face blackened by ash. He was the conductor of this symphony of annihilation. He watched the progress of the fire, directing the demolition teams to knock down specific blocks, to create fire breaks, or to open lines of sight for the archers. He was dismantling a civilization brick by brick. By the seventh day, the city was unrecognizable. The three great streets were level paths of gray ash and compacted flesh. The tall apartment buildings were smoldering stumps. The noise of the battle had changed. The defiant shouts of the first day had faded. The screams of the civilians had quieted, mostly because the civilians were dead. What remained was the crackle of the flames, the thud of the battering rams against the citadel gates, and the low, moaning sound of the survivors huddled on the steps of the Temple of Eshmun at the very peak of the hill. The Romans had reached the top. The Baissa was surrounded. The smoke cleared enough to reveal the final tableau. 50,000 gaunt, terrified people squeezed into the temple precinct, the last remnants of the Punic race. They looked down at the smoking ruin of what had once been the wealthiest city in the world, and they realized that their gods had abandoned them. The fire had scrubbed the city clean of life. Now, only the ashes remained, waiting to be scattered by the wind. By the seventh day, the screaming had largely stopped. The lower city was a charred wasteland of ash and stone, flattened by the Roman shovel brigades. The only thing left standing was the Temple of Eshmun. It sat at the very pinnacle of the Baissa, reachable only by a staircase of 60 steps. Inside this final sanctuary, the last heartbeat of Carthage flickered. Crowded onto the temple steps were 50,000 civilians, the survivors of the fire, the starvation, and the pestilence. They were no longer citizens of a great empire. They were a huddled mass of traumatized refugees, holding olive branches, a universal symbol of supplication. When Scipio appeared at the foot of the stairs, he did not order a massacre. He granted them their lives. The gates were opened, and the 50,000 streamed out, passing through the lines of the legionaries who looked upon them not with hatred, but with the weary curiosity of men who have seen too much death. These survivors were destined for the slave markets of Rome and Sicily, to vanish into the anonymous misery of servitude. But they would live. However, inside the temple building itself, a harder core remained. 900 Roman deserters, men who had fled the legions to fight for Carthage, had barricaded themselves in the sanctuary. They knew there would be no amnesty for them. Crucifixion was the only fate Rome offered traitors. And with them was Hasdrubal the Botharch, the tyrant who had tortured prisoners on the walls, and his family. The end of Hasdrubal is one of the most pathetic scenes in antiquity. As the Romans battered down the doors of the temple precinct, the man who had demanded that his people fight to the death, the man who had starved his citizens to feed his mercenaries, lost his nerve. He slipped away from his men. He crept out of the sanctuary, hiding a suppliant's branch under his cloak. He found Scipio sitting on a stone in the courtyard and threw himself at the Roman's feet, kissing his knees, begging for the life he had denied so many others. Scipio looked down at the weeping tyrant with undisguised disgust. He ordered the Roman deserters to look upon their leader. A roar of fury erupted from the temple. The deserters, realizing they had been abandoned by the man who led them into hell, set fire to the temple themselves. They chose to burn rather than face the cross. But the final word did not belong to Hasdrubal, nor to Scipio. It belonged to Hasdrubal's wife. Her name has been lost to history, erased by the victors, but her voice was recorded by the historian Polybius, who stood at Scipio's side. As the flames consumed the Temple of Eshmun, she appeared on the high roof, dressed in her finest remaining robes, her 2 young sons clinging to her skirts. She looked down through the smoke and saw her husband cowering at Scipio's feet. Her voice, magnified by the acoustics of the dying city, rang out over the crackle of the timber. She did not address her husband. She addressed the Roman general. "Oh, Roman," she cried, "I wish you no harm. You are merely following the laws of war." But as for him, she pointed a trembling finger at Hasdrubal, that traitor, that coward, who betrayed his country, his gods, and his children. "I pray that the ghost of Carthage will hunt him to the ends of the earth." Then she turned her gaze to her husband. "Wretch," she screamed, "you sit there, begging for your life while your city burns. You will live to be paraded in a triumph, but I will not." With a terrifying finality, she drew a knife. She cut the throats of her 2 sons. She cast their bodies into the inferno that was consuming the sanctuary. And then, without a backward glance, she leaped into the flames herself. It was the ultimate rejection of Roman mercy. She preferred the fire to the shame of survival. The last queen of Carthage, in spirit if not in title, died as the city died, proud, violent, and unbowed. The roof collapsed. The Punic soul was extinguished. The fire burned for 17 days. When the flames finally died down, Scipio Aemilianus stood on a hill overlooking the blackened scar where a metropolis of 700,000 people had once lived. He had won. He had fulfilled the mandate of the Senate. He had equaled the glory of his grandfather. But the soldiers who looked at their commander did not see a man flushed with victory. They saw a man weeping. Polybius, the Greek historian who was Scipio's mentor and friend, approached him. He asked why the general was crying. Scipio did not answer immediately. He stared into the smoke, watching the last pillars of the harbor topple into the sea. Then he gripped Polybius's hand and spoke words that have haunted historians for 2 millennia. He did not quote a Roman law. He quoted Homer's Iliad, the lines where Hector foresees the doom of his own city. "The day shall come when sacred Troy shall fall, and Priam, and the people of Priam of the ashen spear." Polybius was confused. "What do you mean by this?" he asked. Scipio turned to him, his eyes red with smoke and tears. "I fear, Polybius," he said, "that in this moment I am seeing the future of Rome." It was a moment of profound historical vertigo. Scipio realized that the destruction of Carthage was not an isolated event. It was part of a cycle. Assyria had fallen. Babylon had fallen. Macedon had fallen. Now Carthage was gone. And one day, the wheel would turn for Rome. He understood that the very efficiency, the very ruthlessness that allowed Rome to erase Carthage, would one day be turned against the eternal city. He was mourning his own civilization while standing on the corpse of its enemy. But philosophy could not stop the machinery of the Senate. The order from Rome was explicit. Destroy it. The surrender was not enough. The burning was not enough. The memory of the place had to be obliterated. The walls, those massive triple fortifications that had defied the legions for 3 years, were dismantled stone by stone. The harbor, the wonder of the Mediterranean, was filled with rubble. The great library of Carthage, containing the literature and history of the Phoenician people, was largely destroyed, save for a few treatises on agriculture that the Romans found useful. The rest was given away to African chieftains or burned. The voice of Carthage was silenced. We know them today almost entirely through the writings of their enemies. 10 commissioners arrived from Rome to oversee the final rites. They pronounced a solemn cursa devotio upon the site. It was forbidden to live there. It was forbidden to plant crops there. The popular myth that the Romans plowed the earth with salt is likely a later invention, a dramatic embellishment of the 19th century. They did not need salt. The curse was enough. The land was declared sacre consecrated to the infernal gods, a place of ghosts and demons. The 50,000 survivors were sold. The markets of Delos and Rome were flooded with Carthaginian flesh. They became field hands, galley slaves, and prostitutes. They were scattered so thoroughly that within a generation, the Punic language, which had been spoken by Hannibal and Dido, began to fade from the earth, surviving only in the murmurs of slaves and the countryside dialects of peasants. For 100 years, the site of Carthage remained a desolate wasteland. Travelers would come to look at the rubble and marvel that such a giant had once stood there. It was a boneyard of broken columns and shattered pottery, inhabited only by hyenas and scavengers. The delenda est of Cato had been achieved with a terrifying literalism. Rome was now the undisputed master of the world. The Mediterranean was a Roman lake. There was no one left to challenge the Republic, but Scipio's premonition proved correct. With the external enemy gone, Rome turned its aggression inward. The destruction of Carthage removed the existential fear that had kept the Roman aristocracy united and disciplined. Without the threat of the Punic War, the Republic descended into luxury, corruption, and eventually a century of civil war that would destroy the Republic just as surely as the fire destroyed Carthage. Scipio himself would die a mysterious death years later, possibly murdered by his own political enemies in Rome. He was the man who killed a civilization, but he never escaped the shadow of the smoke he unleashed. Today, if you stand on the Byrsa Hill in modern Tunis, you will find Roman ruins built on top of the Punic ashes, a bathhouse, a theater, a villa. The Rome that Scipio feared would fall did eventually rise again on this spot, oblivious to the curse. But if you dig deeper, beneath the Roman mosaic floors, you find a layer of black carbon. It is a thick, dark stratum of burnt wood and scorched earth. It is the physical signature of the year 146 BC. It is the silence of a murdered world. The final hours of Carthage were not just the end of a city. They were a testament to the ultimate capacity of human beings to erase one another. As the wind blows off the Gulf of Tunis, stirring the dust of the ruins, it carries the echo of the wife of Hasdrubal, screaming into the fire, reminding us that empires are made of stone, but they are built on blood, and in the end, they all burn.